In this video, we will begin looking into Chapter 10, the chemistry of some toxic substances. Now, by all means, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of toxic materials, but this will cover a good number of the most common ones that you'll see. So, what is toxicity? Or what will qualify something as a toxic substance? Um, and for that, we need to understand there are two different fields of study that go into this. There's toxicology. Toxicology is the study of toxic substances. And so we can get into all sorts of kinds of things in the field of toxicology. We can get into studies of characteristics of different substances or um, how they interact on the body. Um, there's a more specific subset in this called epidemiology, however. And in epidemiology, what we're looking at specifically are the adverse effects that substances that are toxic and what diseases that we do encounter have on the human population. So, epidemiology is a very relevant field. Um, and there's a lot that can kind of go into it, especially when you start looking into things like um, how substances work, um, what happens when you have a widespread kind of outbreak of a disease or an outspread, wide arching kind of toxic kind of nature. Both fields are important, but there are some nuances and differences between them. Now, how do toxic substances actually get into the body? There are three primary modes of entry. The most common one that we think of is ingestion. Ingestion means that we swallow a substance and it goes through our mouth into our digestive system, and that's when it gets passed on to the organs and the tissues of the body. When we think of toxicology, when we think of toxic substances, when we watch things like Law and Order or other kinds of crime-based shows that use toxins and other kinds of modes of um, studying how people die, ingestion is by far the most common form of toxic entry. Now, toxic entry can go through and does go through all the major forms of the digestive system. So it does enter through the mouth. It comes down through the um, um, esophagus and into the stomach. It passes through the intestines, and all along the way, different body systems take nutrients and would take toxins from these. Um, and as a result of this, it does tend to take a little bit of time because think about how long it takes you to digest something. A second mode of entry is skin absorption. Skin absorption is when a toxic material is absorbed, it penetrates through your epidermis, that's your outer layer of skin, and your underlying inner dermis. And from there, it can be absorbed into your circulatory system. So, the primary mode for any of these is how quickly does the toxin get into your blood? Because if it gets into your blood, then it can go to the rest of your body. And with digestion, we know that that's a slow process because the actual barrier, the place to get digested food into your blood is in your intestines, and it can take several hours for that process to occur. With skin absorption, it can be a lot more quick, a lot faster because once we get through that outer layer, once we get through that inner layer, um, the subcutaneous fat has those blood vessels inside of it. And actually, there are blood vessels that go up to the dermis. And so it doesn't take very much to do it. You get a smaller amount of exposure, and you can get a relatively decent amount of toxic material entering the bloodstream through skin absorption. Now, the third type of entry is inhalation. Now, inhalation requires a couple of things. First of all, it has to be a gas or a vapor or a fume. Um, and that discounts a lot of different types of toxins because a number of types of toxins are solid phase or non-volatile liquid phase and just don't absorb, don't volatilize enough to really make inhalation a concern. But for those that do, because of the way that your respiratory and circulatory systems are set up, as soon as you breathe in that toxic material makes your way into your lungs, and your lungs immediately pass it on to your alveoli. And this connects you directly to the blood system. Uh, and so as a result, inhalation is by far the fastest mode of entry in terms of getting toxic material to the rest of your body. And it's also the most dangerous because of that. Now, in addition to talking about modes of entry, we often will talk about certain types of targeting toxins. And so when we talk about targeting toxins, there are different kinds that exist, and they have different names associated with them. So, for example, a hemotoxicant. A hemotoxicant works by decreasing the function of your blood's hemoglobin. And so, um, what that really means is if you think about um, your blood carries within it a protein called a heme. And that heme, which has iron at its center, is able to attract oxygen molecules from the air, from your lungs, from wherever, and actively transport them from one part of your body to another. Um, and the beauty of this system is that the oxygen is attached to the iron, but it's not attached incredibly strongly. It's able to latch on to oxygen and then ditch the oxygen whenever it needs to go, wherever it goes to where it's going. And that's a really important factor to consider because, well, you want the oxygen to be able to detach. It's got to be able to go to the cells that it's working on. And so what chemotoxicants do is they disrupt that relationship in some kind of way. They make it hard for the hemoglobin to attach to oxygen, or they block the hemoglobin and block oxygen from getting to it in some kind of way. And that's how they work. Um, Other types of specific toxicants, hepatotoxicants, these are ones that specifically target your liver. There are also nephrotoxicants. These are ones that specifically target your kidneys. There are neurotoxicants. These ones impact your central nervous system, so your brain, your spine, your nerves, your nerve endings, all can be impacted by neurotoxicants. Reproductive toxicants. These are ones that impact specifically your reproductive capabilities. In men, they can attack things like the testicles or the testes themselves. In women, they can attack fallopian tubes or the ovum itself or the places where the eggs are released. They can also destroy the gametes themselves in some cases, and render the gametes sterile. So different kinds of things can happen with reproductive toxicants. And so that's another way that we can describe different types of toxic materials. We can also describe toxic materials in terms of the way that they work. So asphyxiants, for example. Asphyxiants are things that induce unconsciousness when they're inhaled. So they do so by either denying you sufficient oxygen. So sometimes we see chemotoxicants in this way. Um, that, or we see blocking take place. We also see action as a hemotoxicant, where it actually impacts the shape of the hemoglobin or something otherwise, or it makes it difficult for you to actually use your oxygen. So it actually works at the cellular level and makes it hard for you to metabolize or respirate. And that's what asphyxiants do. Irritants, on the other hand, irritants um, are often associated with inhalation with gases, and they are called irritants because when they come into contact with your body tissues, your lungs, your nasal passages, the like, they will injure those tissues as they come into contact with them, and so they literally hurt when you breathe them in. Now, one more thing to close off this brief introduction, and that is how these toxic substances actually impact your health. Now, depending upon a lot of things, we can talk about things like um, exposure limitations, time, um, other kinds of factors. Um, but the main thing that we can look at is some can cause immediate impairment or death. Some can cause localized effects, so you get encounter a toxic material and it hurts your arm or your lungs or wherever it comes into contact. And some actually have systemic effects where they actually attack the whole body all at the same time. And so which one we see kind of depends on a number of different factors. What the toxic material is, what is being, what body systems it's impacting, how long were you exposed to it, how old are you. Those are all things that have considerable impact. And so in our next video, we'll look at some of the toxicological effects that come as a measure of that, and we'll also look at how we measure dosage and the different kinds of permissible limits that exist. Until then, have a good day.